Well, thank you for rejoining us. And we'll move now to the next contribution on the revolutionary period. And in some ways, although, as I mentioned yesterday, there is quite deliberately no single defining theme for this first Cork History Festival, there are a number of recurring elements in relation to the revolutionary period in Ireland and also to Irish participation in the First World War. And if there was a sort of academic personification of those, it would be David Fitzpatrick. He has written for many years revealingly and compellingly about the local experience of the War of Independence in various parts of the country, only most recently in West Cork, and in relation to parts of the Protestant community, in particular Methodists, in this part of the world. But he's also written extensively about Irish participation in the First World War and the way in which the commemoration of that participation has evolved in more recent decades, indeed the decades since the establishment of the Free State. And he comes to us, therefore, with a fascinating range of reference. And in this paper, he is going to talk about Protestant depopulation and upheaval in Southern Ireland over a much longer period than the revolutionary period that many of our other contributions have focused on. But no doubt he will touch on that. And it is impossible not to refer to the fact, given some of what Andy has said and others have, that David was, of course, Peter Hart's PhD supervisor. So there is perhaps nobody better qualified than him to think both about his work and the way in which that work continues to be a point of reference for other scholars today. So I'd like you all now to welcome Professor David Fitzpatrick.
Thank you so much, Simon, for that kind introduction and for organising such a fantastic festival in a beautiful and, to me, unique location. I feel I have got the soil of the land on my brogues, and I'm glad to have the sun as well to enjoy the weekend. And I'm sure everybody else is having a terrific time here as well. So, Protestant depopulation and upheaval in Southern Ireland, 1845 to 1950. Whatever happened to the Protestants of Southern Ireland during the Irish Revolution? What explains the disappearance of almost one-third of the entire non-Catholic population between the last imperial census in 1911 and its Free State successor in 1926? Were they eliminated through some brand of ethnic cleansing by revolutionaries who regarded Protestants per se as foreign occupiers or potential collaborators? If so, was this achieved through systematic murder or extermination? More plausibly, did communal ostracism and intimidation lead to demoralization and mass emigration? Did partition, the outcome of global war and revolutionary upheaval, result in the deliberate expulsion or the defensive withdrawal of vulnerable minorities, perhaps Northern Catholics as well as Southern Protestants? What other factors could account for such an unnatural decrease on a scale typically observed only in periods of extreme and unmistakable inter-ethnic violence? In short, did Irish minorities share the devastating experience of so many European peoples in the aftermath of both world wars, especially those affected by the imposed partition of colonized territories as in Palestine or India? Such questions have engrossed many historians since Peter Hart reopened that volatile issue of Republican sectarianism almost 2 decades ago, igniting public debate by his provocative comparison with ethnic cleansing in the Balkans. The debate has proceeded, limped along to some extent on 2 fronts, concentrating on either motives or outcomes. The most tendentious exchanges arise from the premise that Catholic nationalism was inherently sectarian, erupting into violence and abuse against Protestants in periods of acute local tension, despite the disavowal of such attacks by so many Republican politicians. The so-called Bandon Valley Massacre of April 1922 is the most widely discussed of these ugly, yet ambiguous episodes. Historians have struggled in vain to disentangle the multiple motives of perpetrators in targeting Protestants out of proportion to their share in the population. I was glad to find in Andy's paper a few moments ago confirmation of that. 31% of the so-called spies and informers who were killed were Protestants, roughly 3 times the Protestant share of the population in the County Cork. Were they selected because they were Protestant, or because individuals who happened to be Protestant were identified as informers, collaborators, or beneficiaries of landlordism and whatever traces remained of Protestant ascendancy? The hypothesis of inherent sectarianism is sociological rather than doctrinal, positing that it was the imputed communal attitudes and affiliations of Protestants, not their views on, say, transubstantiation, that antagonized Catholic nationalists. According to this model, the minority were viewed as alien intruders who were intrinsically hostile to Irish freedom, good enough neighbours normally, but potential traitors at moments of crisis. The debate therefore hangs on that crucial but untestable, in my opinion, question: were the recorded victims the tip of an ever-shrinking Protestant iceberg, or were they selected for particular personal reasons? Deniers of sectarianism point out that most Protestants were not victims of recorded attacks or intimidation, and that Southern Protestant spokesmen only sporadically claimed that their communities were being systematically victimized. Most attacks, moreover, were justified by contemporary apologists as legitimate punishments of known informers, guilty, to use that wonderful adjective again, guilty of crimes, or else as regrettable but excusable reprisals provoked by pogroms against Northern Catholics. In my view, contrary to the judgment of so many contemporaries and historians, the reprisals trope is actually the most convincing proof of endemic Republican sectarianism. Regardless of the relative bigotry and moral culpability of Northern as against Southern perpetrators, they had one thing in common: an ingrained disposition to respond in kind when provoked by outrages they deemed to be sectarian. Now, in earlier studies of this contested topic, I prudently concentrated on testable outcomes rather than dwelling on Republican motives. The response of Southern Protestants to revolutionary upheaval may be assessed at 2 levels: by trying to portray their collective psychology, or by analysing patterns of migration and family formation. Focusing on Methodists in West Cork, I found ample evidence of Republican violence against property and the person, boycotting and intimidation falling short of violence, and outbreaks of communal panic. Though most alleged victims depicted themselves as loyalists, thus qualifying for enhanced compensation awards, many used the terms loyalist and Protestant interchangeably. Yet the most striking message delivered by church leaders and witnesses throughout Southern Ireland was not fear or despair or panic, but communal resilience in clinging to homes and property, even when under fearful threat from neighbours or Republican bosses. This is confirmed by compensation files, which often reveal the return of claimants to their homes after brief tactical withdrawals to Dublin, Britain, sometimes Northern Ireland. Even if local warlords did on occasion attempt ethnic cleansing, it seldom worked. Yet it remains conceivable that niggling fear of persecution or discrimination by the newly dominant Catholic majority was sufficiently pervasive to sap, drop by drop, Protestant morale, leading to continuous leakage through emigration and thence to depopulation. This reopens the issue of that vexatious reduction of 1/3 in the Southern Protestant population between 1911 and 1926. Was the decline truly evidence of an unprecedented exodus in the wake of revolution and partition, or were hidden factors other than migration largely responsible for this depopulation? If so, were these factors also the product of the revolutionary upheaval, or of long-term influences requiring quite different explanations? Now, it's well known that Ireland was the only country to experience continuous depopulation throughout the post-famine century, kick-started by catastrophic mortality, but sustained by the more or less voluntary emigration of at least 1/3 of each new generation. Decline was exacerbated by reduced nuptiality, but this alone would never have yielded net natural decrease, more deaths than births, in a society also notable for high marital fertility and for relatively low and diminishing mortality. All that points towards substantial natural increase. Even with massive emigration, the Irish population never declined by more than 12% during any intercensal decade between the end of the famine, 1851, and 1911, on the eve of the Great War. In a normal human population, as demographers say, continuously regenerating itself, reduction by 1/3 over 15 years is almost inconceivable. This reminds us that the group returned as Protestants of some description on census night was not a normal human population. I'm not saying the Protestants are not human now. Don't misunderstand me. It was a self-defining category, highly sensitive to non-demographic influences. What marked out Protestant depopulation was the fact that membership of the minority, so-called, was not objectively defined by residence, but by the elective category of religious affiliation. Two connected factors tended to deplete the number of Protestants with potentially devastating effect: religious conversion and mixed marriages. Conversions in both directions, often temporary or skin deep, had been commonplace during the spectacular but ultimately counterproductive campaign of superism that challenged Catholic hegemony in the West during and after the Great Famine. Adult conversions, though of unrecorded frequency, were presumably less common after the 1870s. Far more important was the impact of exogamous outward marriages between Protestants and Catholics, which typically resulted in some or all of the children of a Protestant parent being raised as Catholics. That impact should have increased after the application of Ne Temere in April 1908, requiring both parties to any mixed marriage conducted by a priest to undertake that all offspring should be baptized as Catholics, that the Catholic party would have full liberty for the practice of the Catholic religion, and would further endeavour, especially by prayer and the example of a good life, to convert the other to the Catholic faith. Such dispensations applied only to marriages with baptized Christians. The influence of Ne Temere on religious family formation has yet to be fully tested, though I'll come back to that. But a pioneering study of mixed marriages in working-class Dublin, indicated by Martin Maguire, indicated that 4/5 of the progeny of Protestant fathers with Catholic mothers were already being reared as Catholics before Ne Temere in 1901. Let's assume, however, that half of all of the offspring of such marriages went each way, and that 10% of all Protestant brides and grooms married Catholics. Arbitrary figures. If so, the impact on a minority accounting for 10% of the population would be vastly greater than the impact on the 90% Catholic majority, for simple arithmetical reasons. For every 1,000 children with a Protestant parent, 50 would be lost to Catholicism through intermarriage, whereas the loss for Catholics would be only 5.5 in every 1,000. A persistent 5% loss in Protestant child generation would have severe incremental effects. Over 4 generations, all other things being equal, as statisticians evasively suggest, this factor alone would deplete the expected number of incoming Protestant mothers by about 1/5 after 4 generations. In the absence of aggregate data on the frequency and character of mixed marriages, let us pry into the family census returns for Skibbereen in 1911. By browsing the schedules for all married Protestants, it's simple, if laborious, to identify all cases in which a Protestant had married a co-resident Catholic. That is, a Catholic who at census time was co-resident. It turns out that Skibbereen electoral division had 78 families with 2 non-Catholic parents. In almost all cases, both parents were of the same denomination, including a dozen Methodist couples. There were 2 exceptions. William Alexander Russell, a Presbyterian shopkeeper in Main Street, had a wife and 3 children belonging to the Church of Ireland. Charles James Donnelly Swift was a photographer married to an Anglican. Both were natives of England. Like their toddler son, he rather surprisingly espoused Islam. Cosmopolitan, multicultural Skibbereen was already incubating in 1911. There were also 6 mixed marriages coupling Protestant Episcopalians with Catholics, indicating that about 7% of Skibbereen marriages involving Protestants were exogamous. The 3 Protestant husbands were John Hall, an unemployed invalid living in Main Street and married to a Catholic peddler; Michael Mara, a farmer in Bridge Street, Difficult to imagine a farmer living in Bridge Street today. Staying in the bed and breakfast in what appears to be the heart of modern multicultural urban Skibbereen, and the very epicenter of the beginning of the Skibbereen Arts Festival last night, which is a wonderful experience. In any case, Michael Mara lived there, a farmer, and Isaac Salter, a mason in the nearby Mardyke. Hall's 2 sons were raised as Catholics, but the 7 children of Mara and Salter were all of the Church of Ireland. By contrast, all 7 children of mixed marriages with Protestant mothers were raised as Catholics. None of these families of mixed parenthood included both Catholic and Protestant children, so the famous split down the middle of folklore did not apply any more than it applied, according to Martin Maguire, in working-class Dublin mixed marriages. Marjorie Crowley of Malbrack had married an Irish-speaking electrician. Elizabeth Dolan was the wife of a Catholic draper in Main Street, and Maria Frances Harriet O'Mara, as the wife of a Catholic doctor and justice of the peace, lived in a first-class house with 22 rooms in North Street. It's noteworthy that all 12 partners in these mixed marriages were Irish-born, mainly from County Cork, and that Protestants with Catholic wives lived in much smaller houses than Protestant wives with Catholic husbands. The census reveals nothing at all about marriages, perhaps numerous, perhaps not, in which one spouse had adopted the other's religion. So in other words, the extent of mixed marriages is something very difficult to establish for all sorts of reasons. Census returns, being occasional snapshots rather than life histories, cannot fully clarify the mysterious process of Protestant depopulation. Congregational records, though patchy, are potentially more revealing. My study of annual membership returns for the Methodist and Presbyterian churches showed fairly steady decline throughout the period 1911 to 1926, only slightly accelerated during the Revolutionary Triennium, ending March 1923. Though no aggregated returns are available for the Church of Ireland, the net population loss over 15 years was almost identical for all 3 denominations. In other words, I think there's a case for extrapolating from the incomplete returns of the smaller churches. It's the best we've got. Only the Methodists maintain systematic returns, allowing us to disentangle some of the complex strands of demographic change. Ministers are required to submit annual returns not just of membership, but of admissions, cessations, deaths, emigration to districts outside Ireland, and removals between different circuits within Ireland. These figures enable us to chart both internal and external migration, though the numbers of admissions to adult membership provides only a fuzzy proxy for Methodist fertility 2 decades earlier. So they're not perfect, but they're very good, these Methodist records. What lessons can be drawn from these returns? First, the strongest depopulating factor between 1920 and 23, the Revolutionary Triennium, was not outmigration or cessations of membership through conversion or otherwise, but a dearth of recruits. Certainly there was evidence of increased emigration, reflecting the general resumption of movement from Ireland after the Great War and from Europe after the Great War, as well as some net movement from southern to northern circuits within Ireland. Yet the intensity of Methodist emigration in the Revolutionary Triennium was actually lower than during the Home Rule crisis, 1911 to 14. And cross-border migration was quite minor. Now, I think that's quite an important fact when we talk about an exodus, a revolutionary exodus, that the emigration was heavier in that crisis, the earlier crisis before the Great War. Bravely treating Methodists as a 5% microcosm of the entire southern Protestant population, for which I have been denounced by various people, I put forward the following deadpan summary in my book Descendancy, Protestant Histories in Ireland since 1795, a really good read which is available at an incredibly low price next door. Now, I'm quoting it here because it is a little deadpan and it's better to do it in quotation marks. But these are the important statistical findings from an over-elaborated study. This would imply that an adult population of about 190,000 Southern Protestants in 1920 was depleted by 15,000 emigrants over the triennium 1920 to 23. But that accounts for only a quarter of all the emigrants from 1911 to 26. Well below the loss for 1911 to 14. 8,000 deaths, somewhat below the pre-war level, and 10,000 cessations of active membership, far below the number recorded for 1911 to 14. The sole revolutionary aberration was 4,000 net internal removals from the south to the north, meaning the future Northern Ireland, almost 7 times the pre-war figure. With only 17,000 entrants to compensate for 37,000 losses during the revolutionary triennium, the long-term decline in the South's Protestant community had accelerated significantly. Well, there you go, that's defensive. Now, back to the present. Some will object that the Methodist record may have been unrepresentative. It is indeed conceivable that Anglicans were more affected by outmigration and less crippled by faltering recruitment of new members. Some children of Methodists may have sought safety in numbers by attending the parish church rather than an isolated chapel or meeting house. Even so, since net depopulation was almost identical for Methodism and the Church of Ireland, it seems implausible that the much bigger church was ravaged by a vastly greater human exodus proportionately. As usual, historians must rely on incomplete documentation and offer informed speculations rather than definitive solutions. Whenever we claim to have either a definitive solution or one coming up when we've improved our database slightly, we're probably deluding ourselves to a degree. There never will be one for most of the great historical questions. So far, these obscure and generally ignored tabulations of Irish Methodism provide our only deep probe into the process by which Southern Ireland's once ascendant minority population was quietly dismantled. If faltering recruitment was indeed the key to Protestant decline, what was its origin and when did it become apparent? While preparing this paper, I began to realize that the process could only be understood by analyzing demographic change in Southern Ireland over a much longer period than 15 years, 1911-26, however turbulent. Why have so few, or relatively few, historians of this controversial subject, including myself, adopted the telescopic approach? Now, honourable exceptions include Andy Bielenberg, I must say, and Enda Delaney, building on local studies by Martin Maguire of Dublin that I mentioned, and also Kirby Miller, Liam Kennedy, and others. The strongest disincentive, however, to the telescopic approach is the labour involved in reconstituting separate figures for the South and the North before 1926, when the census itself was conveniently partitioned. So you have to sort of repartition the census for the United Ireland, and it creates all sorts of technical problems. Since the Protestant component of the entire Irish population slowly but steadily increased between 1861 and 1911, it's conveniently easy to assume that the same applied within regions. In fact, the religious partition of Ireland was already far advanced before 1911, as shown by comparing the statistical records for the future territories of the Irish Free State and Northern Ireland. The comparison is summarized in Table 1 of the handout, which you don't have, but you can have it. Now, this handout begins in Table 1 by broadening our survey to the period 1901 to 1940. So it's incorporating one of the great decades of social and economic reform and so-called progress in Ireland before the Great War and the early period of the consolidation of the Free State. So we're looking at the revolutionary period in that broader context. All census calculations are restricted to females. Now, that's not a sort of affirmative action statement from me. It's to minimize distortions caused by the inclusion of military personnel only temporarily resident in Ireland. And arguments over how many of these military personnel there were, how Irish they were, can they really be counted, etc., can be bypassed to a large degree by the simple technique of forgetting about the men. Why don't people do it more often? These figures suggest that revolutionary turbulence markedly accelerated a continuing process of Protestant depopulation in the south, whereas little change occurred in the north. The number and proportion of northern Protestants increased very slowly between 1901 and 1936 or 7. So you'll see there that there were 420,000 non-Catholics in Northern Ireland in 1901. There were 438,000 in 1936. And almost no change in the proportion, 2/3 Protestant, 1/3 Catholic, right through that period. So there was no perceptible blip attributable to partition and civil conflict. Nothing to suggest that these incidents, which created something like a civil war in Northern Ireland as well as the South, resulted in any significant change in the religious complexion of that northern population. In the South, however, the Protestant proportion dropped from 11% to 7%, most sharply between 1911 and 26, and the concentration of Irish Protestants in the North intensified. So again, you can see, if you can bear to look through those figures now or later, you'll see how this works. So of all non-Catholics in Ireland, about 29% were living in the South in 1901. That's down to 18% in 1936. So it's been a very significant shift. That's a big shift. Whereas in the North, it remains constant, about 86%. Census returns provide limited insight into the success of the southern minority in regenerating itself. But useful clues may be derived from its age distribution, whereas many people think there are no figures by religious denomination and age. But there are, hidden away in the educational statistics of Ireland. We know one thing at most census times: how many Protestants as against Catholics were under 5. Now, we only know that because it's important to a calculation of literacy. Anyway, it's very useful because we find that the proportion that under 5s accounted for about 1/10 of Southern Catholics throughout the period. 1/10 of the entire Southern Catholic population were under 5. The proportion for Southern Protestants dropped from 8.5% in 1901 to just 5.5% by 1936. Now, that's a very serious situation, if only in the demographic context at the time, if only 5.5% of your population is under 5. So just something's going radically wrong with a communal regeneration. This precipitate decline in the proportion of young children is a sure sign of faltering recruitment, attributable either to lower nuptiality, lower fertility within marriage, or higher incidence of mixed marriages leading to children of a Protestant parent being reared as Catholics. Other figures exploiting digital census searches confirm the impression of a steadily aging Protestant minority in Southern Ireland. So I've incorporated those figures. They're not perfect, but again, as good as can be got. It's true that the southern population as a whole was growing older during the early 20th century, but far more slowly. Now, in 1901, the Church of Ireland's age profile was only slightly aberrant, 36% being under 20 and 27% over 45. I'm sorry to load all these figures on you, but really a lot of these sort of bread and butter issues, and much more than bread and butter issues that we've been discussing, can only be even provisionally resolved if we can get the statistics right, if we can get the aggregate picture right. So you'll see there in lines 5 and 6 of Table 1, figures which show the inexorable reduction of the young population and increase in the old population over time. By 1936, barely a quarter of the Free State's Protestant Episcopalians were aged under 20, 2/5 having reached 45. Huge difference from 1901. The aging process was continuous, with no clear sign of acceleration due to revolutionary upheaval. Now, declining Protestant nuptiality is illustrated by the returns of registered marriages, and here again they've been analysed by Andy for the period 1911 to 26. These distinguish between Catholic marriages, which were first registered in 1864, and those conducted by non-Catholic celebrants or by registrars, collected from April 1845. Table 1 shows at the bottom the number and proportion of non-Catholic religious marriages decline continuously in the South, with marked acceleration between 1921 and 30. The relative Protestant decline in nuptiality was even sharper than the drop in population. Meanwhile, as usual, nothing much changed in the North. Well, even I am becoming restive with all this stuff, so I want to move for a moment from the demographic picture to show how this may be echoed in specific personal stories relating to West Cork. Now, one symptom of the dearth of younger Protestants was the advanced age of many targets of revolutionary violence in West Cork and elsewhere, qualifying the notion that the Irish Revolution was a young man's game. Very few Methodist victims or claimants for compensation were aged less than 50. Thomas Bradfield of Knockmacool, the first Methodist to be murdered in the region, was a substantial farmer aged 55. Now, I'm treating him as elderly, although from my perspective he's a young fellow, but still he's over 50, when abducted and shot in February 1921. Though his widow's brother and nephew, John William Good, were also murdered, Elizabeth Bradford eventually came home from exile in Berkshire to die in Bandon. Joseph Hosford of nearby Gaggan was a stone-blind Methodist farmer, aged 50, when kidnapped and ordered out of the country. He twice retreated to the Isle of Man, only to return to Gaggan in August 1922, when, so he rather surprisingly remarked, things had quietened down somewhat through the coming of the National Army, August 1922. So, again, a perspective difficult to adopt from our own historian's point of view. Gilbert Fenton, a Methodist insurance inspector of the same townland of Gaggan, was 67 when he and his son fought off raiders who wielded a hatchet and seriously injured his son. Alfred Charles Riley of Cork City and John Cathcart of Youghal, the only Methodists apart from Bradfield who were murdered in the county before the truce of July 1921, were business managers aged 58 and 50. Other mature Methodist victims of violence or intimidation included William Bernard Roycroft, 53, a Bantry auctioneer; William Hosford Bryan of Maryville, Enniskeen, 56, a farmer whose cattle were stolen when he refused to contribute to IRA funds; and John Willis of Ballinfelloc, 65, an executive member of the Irish Unionist Alliance, who refused to resign his magistracy when so ordered by the IRA. And now, I think he was the only Methodist victim that stated, and in fact boasted, of his political activity as a unionist, of all those who testified and had to prove their loyalism in order to obtain compensation. John Willis. Joseph Hosford of Shanaway East, 66, was forced to sell his farm at a substantial loss and to pay £50 for a permit from the IRA for doing so. Hosford's testimony vividly evokes his panic and demoralization after the shooting of a nephew and a near neighbour. Those events, together with daily and nightly visits from the rebels for food, money and beds, produced in my family such a state of nerves and dread that when we heard our dogs bark at night, there was no more sleep that night, and expecting any minute the worst to happen. Such events made us decide that life was not worth living. But they went on living it. Joseph Hosford and his family moved to a small farm near Exeter and are not known to have tested the goodwill of their West Cork neighbours in later years, unlike so many other temporary exiles. This was perhaps fortunate for Joseph the Younger, one of 3 West Cork Methodists, believed by intelligence officers on more or less credible grounds, no doubt, of the 1st Southern Division, to be guilty of offences against the nation and the army during hostilities and to date, or else suspected of having assisted the enemy during the same period. So this was the list compiled during the truce in the expectation of resumption of the hostilities when hundreds were to be executed. Poor Joseph the Younger would have been liable to execution under those circumstances. The only evidence of his disloyalty to the nation was that he was friendly with 2 local farmers allegedly implicated in the murder of the Coffey brothers in reprisal for that of Thomas Bradfield of Knockmacool, the first Methodist to be murdered in West Cork. Advanced age, of course, added pathos to compensation claims. William Kingston of Rough Grove, Bandon, not sure if he's a distant relation, probably not, there are an awful lot of Methodist Kingstons, I understand, but he was only 33, according to his census return in 1911, claimed to be 65 by 1927. Well, again, simple arithmetic suggests something odd's going on here. When fruitlessly seeking compensation for shootings and beatings leading to exile in Kent, along with his horses, cattle, wife, and 13 children. Having refused an order to leave the country on the night of Bradfield's murder, Kingston had been captured, taken before an army of about 300, beaten by 6 men, and kicked, 4 teeth knocked out. The most notorious local case of revolutionary elder abuse was that of James Bottomer, 81, a second night victim of the Bandon Valley rampage, launched on the 26th of April 1922, about which we've already heard. It was Buttimer's wife, Clarina, 17 years his junior, who eventually opened the door in response to prolonged knocking, banging, and shouting which left them both quaking with terror and nearly demented. The raiders demanded to talk to her husband, repeatedly sneering, "You go to bed, we don't want you." Buttimer, a retired draper severely affected by rheumatism, and clad only in his night attire and slippers, appealed for clemency. "Surely, boys, you would not harm an old man like me." According to his wife's testimony, the boy's answer came simultaneously from several weapons, and he was soon lying in pools of blood. His teeth were scattered all over the place as his jaw was smashed in, and he was riddled with bullets. In addition to the selection of older West Cork Methodists for physical punishment, several septuagenarians headed families that left Ireland, under more or less duress, during 1921. Louisa Copythorne, 75, a Skibbereen draper's widow, abandoned Snugville, cosily so called, in Townsend Street, for the Isle of Man. William Nagle, 70, abandoned shopkeeper, chose Canada. Mary Ann Buttimer, 70, widow of a farmer and shopkeeper in Sovereign Street, Clonakilty, emigrated to Philadelphia. James Good, 76, a farmer from Kinsale, emigrated to an unknown destination in spring 1921. Whereas Irish emigration typically involved young unmarried adults, the abnormal displacement of families in the revolutionary period took no account of age. It would be absurd to infer that assassins and intimidators were particularly venomous towards older Protestants. So I'm not making the old statistical error of saying because a lot of them were old, that indicates ageism as a major incentive for the killing of civilians during this period. What these cases illustrate is the predominance of older people within a minority that was generally at risk. So you have an aging population, and that inevitably meant that many of those who suffered most were those less able to respond, less flexible because of age and ties to their home place. The decline of Protestant nuptiality and the associated failure of communal regeneration were trends apparent in Southern Ireland long before 1900. Now, Table 2 applies a still wider lens, making use of the earliest available census returns of religious profession. Between 1861 and 1911, admittedly, the non-Catholic component of the southern population scarcely changed, whereas it declined by 1/3 over the following 35 years. But the crucial under 5 component that I referred to earlier, that clear indicator of possibility of regeneration, was already significantly below that for Catholics, and it fell away continuously between 1861 and 1936. So over that whole period, the under 5's proportion halved from 11 to 5.5%, an ominous sign of demographic collapse. Meanwhile, the regional distribution of Ireland's remaining non-Catholics had been transformed. The proportion living in the south fell steadily from 35% in 1861 to 27% in 1911, withering to just 18% by the 1930s. So again, supporting the idea that social and cultural partition was already well established half-century before official partition was imposed with the creation of separate states. Now, the atrophy of southern Protestantism was less pronounced in Leinster and the 3 lost counties, as they came to be called, of Ulster, and more rapid in Connaught than in Munster up to 1911. The Protestant minority in Skibbereen Union, you may be interested to know, showed little sign of demographic atrophy, even in 1901 and 1911, when the proportion of young children was almost identical for Catholics and Protestants, around 10%. In general, however, the relentless demographic retreat of the southern minority was a striking testament to the failure of the Union to encourage and sustain a multicultural and mutually tolerant society. Now, finished with the statistics, turn over the page, and even worse, charts. Don't worry, the lesson's much the same, but I hope that by displaying it in graphical form, I can make even clearer how important these changes were. And in chart 1, you have the proportion of marriages which were non-Catholic. And we've got to focus on that proportion rather than absolute number of marriages, because nuptiality was highly sensitive to economic conditions and emigration levels. So if the economy was faltering, to have heavier emigration, and people would either postpone their marriages or they would emigrate without marrying in Ireland. So these economic fluctuations very heavily mimicked in marriage returns. But if we take the proportion, that year-by-year factor is less important. Anyway, as a proportion of all southern marriages, non-Catholic registrations fell from 13.3% in the 1860s right down to 5.9% in the 1930s. Obvious from the 1880s. Now, and you can see that if you look at that chart, chart 1, and in fact chart 2 also, it's difficult to pick a trend. If you just looked up to 1890, I've misplaced the label land war, by the way. I apologize for that. I was in a hurry trying to get the handout ready. But you'll see there that it would be difficult for any statistician to pick a trend at that point. The trend becomes obvious from the late 1880s and is only interrupted during the period of the Great War, when the Protestant proportion of marriages shot up, followed by the period of the Revolution, when it went sharply down again. But the point is that when you look at the trend line, these are temporary blips. It's very obvious when you take the long course of the non-Catholic proportion. The impact on Protestant nuptiality of war and revolution, which we found was so dramatic in close-up, amounted to nothing more than a wobble in a long-term downward trend. And the promulgation of Ne to Mary in 1908 did not contribute so much as a wobble. If you can find 1918 on the chart, or 1908 on the chart, you will see that. Now, chart 2 complicates the story by contrasting the courses of decline in the various provinces. And I won't go through this in detail. I've used a logarithmic scale, and I'm sure that most of you are familiar with, understand why I've used a logarithmic scale, because it allows you to compare trends between different series, and it eliminates the problem of the absolute differences. So if you look at those trend lines, you'll see how similar the patterns for Munster and Leinster are. They're fluctuating, but the downward trend is pretty clear from the 1880s. Munster and also Cork are not aberrant in this respect. You can see the patterns are applying to both provinces. In Leinster, the case of Leinster, there's much less variation from year to year. In the case of the 3 counties of Ulster, there's less decline overall. And in the case of the 6 counties of the future Northern Ireland, there's almost no change over the whole period year by year. Now, the most spectacular figures for connoisseurs of such spectacles show the southern component of all non-Catholic marriages. That's chart 3. If we incorporate even earlier returns than the ones in the table, available from 1845, just at the beginning of the Great Famine, the scale of the regional shift seems even more startling. The regional shift in Protestant nuptiality shows us that in 1847 and 48, at the height of the Great Famine, 47.5%, nearly half of all marriages in the future Southern Ireland were Protestant. 47.5%. All right? And if you look at the map, you will see that that had fallen to 10% by the 1940s, where we're talking about an utter transformation of the Protestant community of Ireland. A shift from a position where nearly half of the marriages of Protestants occurred in the south of Ireland to one in which 10% occurred in Southern Ireland. Now that has enormous implications for what was happening to the minority in this country. Now, what do these findings tell us about the underlying sources of Protestant decline in Southern Ireland over the post-famine century? The demographic failure of a community to reproduce itself can only be explained by deep-seated flaws or fractures in the institutions and practices that sustain that community. Strictly speaking, there was no unified Protestant community in Ireland. partly because of the lingering conflicts and resentments that divided the many strands of Reformed Christianity, reformed in inverted commas. More fundamentally, the communities centered on particular denominations or congregations. These communities were volatile and unstable, requiring far stronger support to preserve and regenerate their integrity than the mere presence of a minister or of a building or even of a code of shared beliefs. Since membership of a church was elective and reversible, the continued affiliation of existing members, and especially their children, could only be sustained through provision of social benefits and of penalties for defaulters. It's an artificial loyalty and allegiance. All major churches offered matching bundles of benefits for their members throughout the post-famine century, especially schooling under clerical management, an elaborate array of overlapping youth organizations, choirs, fraternities and temperance societies, and charitable aid for orphans, the infirm, the indigent poor. In addition, all denominations did their best to police reproduction by pressing or cajoling offspring into church marriages, and by withholding benefits from those who married or procreated outside the community. Though also inhibiting movement between Protestant denominations, these defensive measures were primarily directed against intermarriage with Romans, as they were known. That strategy, and there were ruder terms as well, that strategy was enthusiastically reinforced by pan-Protestant institutions such as the Orange Order, which enrolled and mobilized a significant minority of Southern loyalists, so-called at moments of crisis, such as 1798, 1848, 1881, 1886, 1893, and 1912-14. Paradoxically, more aggressive policing of mixed marriages by the Catholic clergy, as under Nata Mary, further encouraged Protestants to stick to their own. These measures may have been counterproductive. So long as vestiges remained of Protestant ascendancy, if only as a badge of social or economic superiority, the Church of Ireland minority in particular had the advantage of not competing on that fabled and longed-for level playing field. Privilege provided a crucial additional impetus for communal regeneration, an impetus that was progressively eroded throughout the 19th century. The cumulative effect of Catholic emancipation, extension of the franchise, disestablishment of the Church, land reform, and broader Catholic access to the professions and the public sector was to reduce Protestant privilege from a legal and economic reality to an increasingly spurious sense of communal superiority. From the minority's viewpoint, the Irish Revolution was not restricted to that brief spasm of political and military mayhem that generated partition in 1921-22. For many Protestants, this was merely the latest phase in a campaign for Catholic nationalist supremacy, in direct succession to the convulsions of the 1640s, the Battle of the Boyne, Scullabogue, the depredations of white boys and ribbon men, the nightmare of the land war and the plan of campaign. That sense of historical continuity was shared by Sinn Féiners and Republicans. Hope for the future, shared histories. Celebration of previous rebellions and mass movements was intrinsic to Republican ideology, and local activists made no distinction between Fenians and Landleaguers when constructing their own revolutionary lineages. When working in the 1970s on Revolutionary Clare, I was initially perplexed by the apparent inability of veterans to distinguish between the issues at stake in the Land War and the Tan War. Eventually I realized that these veterans had a surer grasp of revolution realities than historians transfixed by political or constitutional issues. When threatening or attacking some elderly and vulnerable Protestant neighbor in 1921 or 1922, assailants were also avenging past wrongs attributed to his privileged communal forebears. Families identified as caretakers or grabbers in the land war were particularly execrated, and some of these were targeted in West Cork. William Bryan of Knocknacarra, Bandon, was tainted by the fact that in 1884, when he was 11, his father had taken possession of a 121-acre farm after a rent strike leading to an eviction. The evicted Flynn family was subsequently housed in a hut belonging to the family of Sean Hales. On the 25th of July 1922, in his capacity as brigade commandant rather than pro-treaty deputy, Hales personally induced Bryan to save his skin by surrendering his farm, stock, equipment and furniture to Hales in return for £100. Bryan had enough pride to refuse to cash that cheque. In the following summer, the new government refused to intervene in order to facilitate a fair auction of the still unoccupied property, the stock having been moved to, presumably to Hales's other farms. Disingenuously discerning, the government said, no reason why Mr. William Bryan should now not take steps for its sale. Bryan eventually secured enough compensation to enable him to buy a farm in Ashford, Kent, close to that acquired by his old neighbour William Kingston of Rough Grove. Meanwhile, as the Bryans moved from one set of lodgings to another in various parts of England, the shock to myself and wife, thrown out of home and lands with no hope of returning to Ireland, and separated from our children, made us both nearly demented. For those threatened by a continuing revolution steeped in sectarian resentments, the temptation to join or placate the winning side steadily increased, presumably leading to additional conversions and mixed marriages. Long before partition became official, a marked regional contrast in Protestant morale had become apparent. While Protestants faced the prospect of gradual extinction in the south, those in Ulster engineered the province's industrial revolution. Episcopalian landed families lost sway to a large degree, as in the south, but industrialization created a new Ulster elite, mainly peopled by Presbyterians and Methodists. Once again, the demographic history of the future 6 counties mirrored broader social transformation. As Ulster Protestants prepared to exercise their own variety of state-sponsored ascendancy in Northern Ireland, they showed every sign of communal and demographic robustness. Today, however, if I were to depict the demographic condition and the morale of ex-Protestants, as I have to call them in Northern Ireland, I would say their position is akin to that of Southern Protestants a century ago. This study suggests that Protestant depopulation in Southern Ireland was indeed a byproduct of revolutionary upheaval, but not of the revolution that most historians have proposed, Delaney and company accepted. The demographic impact of the convulsions that followed the Great War, though significant, merely accelerated trends set at least half a century earlier. The informal religious partition of North and South was already becoming more pronounced, and the ability of Southern Protestants to maintain their minority communities was already seriously impaired before 1900. Yet, in spite of long-term shrinkage and the erosion of Protestant ascendancy, these communities did not collapse. They just faded away. Or did they? Thank you.